Hi, I'm Paul,
And I'm Bucky.
and we're here with Paul and Bucky's Skills for Life.
And today we are going to talk about mental illness. We're going to start by just talking about the normal stress that people have in their lives every day that has to do with our mental health, but it might not mean that you have a mental illness. These are those sort of normal life stressors that we come in contact with. It can be your schedule, work schedule, your school schedule. It could be maybe you've lost a job. Maybe there was a breakup in a relationship, or maybe you have lost a loved one. And these are sort of normal life stressors that hit us. And can cause us to feel sad or depressed, or we may feel anxious at times because of we have a big event coming up that we may have to, maybe we have to present at the big event. So that may cause us some anxiety. So those feelings of sadness, anxious feelings are not necessarily mean that you have a mental illness. But mental illness is something that's very real, and it's something that affects many people. You may yourself have a mental illness, or you may know of someone, a loved one who has a mental illness, or somebody in your family may have a mental illness. And so I just want to give you some idea. Basically, 1 in 5, and these statistics that I'm about to go over are from the National Alliance of Mental Health, but 1 in 5 adults have a mental illness. 1 in 20 have serious mental illnesses, and 1 in 6 youth, age 6 to 17, experience a mental health disorder. And very high on the list of mental illnesses is, surprise, surprise, anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are very prevalent among mental illnesses. Other things like very high rate of mental illness among our LGBTQ community. And a lot of that has to do with the social, not being socially accepted, traumatized, those types of things. So those are things to just think about. Paul is going to talk a little bit about defining what mental illness is. So take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Bucky. Well, Bucky pointed out that we have lots of stress in our lives, and there's lots of periods in our lives, like adolescence and adults and older adults and younger adults. We all have different challenges that we face, and while those don't necessarily mean that we have a mental illness, those things can certainly make our mental illnesses more prominent or worse. So when we experience more stress than we can handle, that's when it can really make just like our body, we also know that our body gets more prone to being sick with things like colds or viruses. When we're under more stress, we're also more susceptible to exacerbating or making worse our mental illnesses. So I want to talk a little bit about what is a mental disorder. And I want to say there's a lot of power in being able to label a mental disorder. In a lot of ways, it's society's power of saying this is what's normal and this isn't what's normal. And we take behavior and we say that, boy, that behavior is outside the norm. So I want you to keep in mind that a lot of times mental health disorders aren't necessarily things that depression isn't something that is a natural occurring thing. It is, but it's also a clump of symptoms that people experience that we've brought together, and we call that depression. So in some ways, it's a human-made construct, something that we've come up and decided to call depression. And a lot of the mental disorders have changed over time as our understanding has grown. or we've recognized different mental disorders, or we see changes in the way, or we didn't include symptoms that we needed to. So just be aware that while these are real things that people experience, there's also a lot of human judgment, definition, and our own naming of these things that comes into play. So a lot of times when we think about what is a mental health disorder, we all have a little bit of some of those traits or behaviors in us. Like I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, I'm so OCD," or I'm so ADD or ADHD, and really what that means is we all have challenges around things like, and it's does our behavior come to the level of a disorder? And there's a couple of criteria for that. I mean, we can all have a little bit of obsessive compulsive disorder sometimes, but it's not, or obsessive compulsive behavior, but it doesn't register as to the level of an actual disorder. So recognizing that some of these behaviors we can all have. So usually when we look at a mental disorder to see if it is this a mental disorder, does it cause a lot of pain and interrupt a person's life a lot? Are there a lot of, does it interrupt your ability to work? Does it interrupt your relationships with people, your ability to be in society? And that is one definition. Also, is it a norm? Is it something that most people typically go through or do? Or is it outside that norm? Is it behavior that also that doesn't seem normal for us? Like sometimes, like with depression, you might say, boy, Paul's not acting like he normally does. Like Paul would normally not act like that, but now suddenly he's acting differently. And then you have sometimes people who have behaviors that they don't recognize in themselves as not normal, but other people might recognize as not normal. So all these definitions that we have great exceptions. So sometimes there are very great people who have had behaviors outside of the norm. Ben Franklin, for example, he was very strange to early people who settled in America because he bathed every day. And they believed that bathing would cause one to die, that getting too much water would kill you. And yet he bucked the norm, and he went ahead and showered every day, and thank God he did that, because now we all shower regularly, and that's a good thing for both health and hygiene. So that was a positive example of someone who steps outside of the norm. And then we also have to consider cultural behaviors. In some cultures, the community plays a big role, and there's safe communities that play a big role in raising children. So parents might go out to dinner, and they might leave their baby in the carriage out in front of the restaurant while they enjoy their meal. And if you did that in our culture in America, then that would probably be cause for child neglect, and we would call Child Protective Services. But in some cultures, that is absolutely normal and fine to do. In some cultures, adolescent men are treated as adults, and their parents don't really tell them what to do anymore. They're in charge of their lives. But here, in our country, you're still responsible for your children, even today, even beyond 18 sometimes. And so if you're not, watching every move your child makes, then that could be considered neglectful. So we have to really take in cultural context before we label behavior as normal or not normal. And then there are people who, like Gandhi, for example, who, he went on a hunger strike. Did he have a mental illness by not eating? Sometimes people who don't eat, we call that an eating disorder. But then there are people like Gandhi who go on a hunger strike and don't eat for 40 days. And he's teaching us how to, be peaceful and to make a statement in a peaceful way. So cultural context is so important in how we do this. There are also some disorders, and we'll talk more about biology, but some disorders are considered cultural disorders that only occur in certain cultures. Like, for example, um, eating disorders are disorders that are typically in Western societies where the media plays a large role in telling us um, what appearance is acceptable and what is beautiful, quote unquote. Um, and lo and behold, where there's this massive messaging from the media, those cultures tend to have eating disorders, where cultures that don't necessarily have those messages don't. So some of those disorders are even things that happen in cultures. And then there's other disorders that happen, like schizophrenia. About 5% of the population has that across the world, no matter what culture you're in. So we have to take that into consideration as well. And I want to just talk a minute about biology, in that sometimes we like to think of our body and our mind as separate. And what we're learning more all the time about the brain. And there's a lot that we don't know in the body and our connection to behavior. And we know now that there is a pretty big connection between behavior and our biology. So, for example, when some people start taking antidepressants, adolescents, we're not sure why, but that may cause them to have suicidality for the first few weeks of taking a medication. So it's a clear example of biology dictating someone's behavior. The famous case in psychology, Phineas Gage, when through a railroad accident, he had a spike that broke part of his brain, went right through his brain, and that changed his personality. So we know that at least to some extent, our personality is biological in basis. So understanding that sometimes that when we look at things like depression, anxiety, there may be nothing that we're doing that causes that, but actually our biology. So with anxiety, for example, some people have the amygdala in your brain, some people that's more active. And so they tend to have more anxiety than someone else. And we'll talk about stigma later, but it's really unfair to compare people to ourselves sometimes. And we're like, well, that happened to me and I didn't get that upset. When really we all experience different levels of pain and challenge, and what might not be difficult for me might be very difficult for someone else. So it's really important that we have empathy and remember that we're all biologically unique people. While we do have a lot of similarities, we are also very different biologically. And we know that some disorders are definitely connected to biology. So we know that therapy can actually change your brain. So by learning new behaviors, you're actually changing the way that your brain works and makes it easier for you to continue those behaviors. And your brain structure actually changes as a result of thinking in new ways or even learning. So it's important to understand that connection between biology and our mental health. That sometimes it really isn't, and I say that so that we know that to have more empathy for people, that sometimes our biology is dictating our behavior. And that's not an excuse that we can't change our behavior, but it helps us to understand more and be more empathetic. And so, Bucky, you're going to go into some more stigma.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the stigma around mental illness in the past has been not very good, but I think people are beginning to, as we understand more and learn more about mental illness, people are becoming more accepting and are becoming more open-minded about mental illness. It's really important to remember too, that if you suffer from a mental illness, you are not your disorder. As Paul mentioned earlier, these disorders have these certain characteristics and that are common among people who have the disorder, but you bring your own unique personality and your own unique strengths to the illness. So it's really important that that people who are suffering from mental illness can separate themselves from that. Also, just that basically those measures of that are used to diagnose mental illness, those measures are what those people have in common, but it doesn't talk about the unique differences that people bring. So it's really important to remember that. And I think too, when we look at mental illness, we can say, oh, well, that person's really depressed all the time. They must, be they have depression or whatever. Looking not at the illness as much as looking at what that person brings to the situation, and what are their unique strengths. And I know that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is where, like, when dealing with people with mental illness, this is where those active listening skills are really, really important when talking to people. Asking open-ended questions, being really reflective about what you're hearing about, and definitely affirming the strengths that they are showing, because we all have those strengths. So I also want to talk a little bit about managing mental illness. And actually, these things that I'm going to talk about are things that you could also use to manage your mental health in general. You don't have to have a mental illness to do this, but if you do have a mental illness, these are some things that can help. First of all, just accept your needs. There's certain things that are triggering to you, and so if the more you know what those triggers are, like maybe if you're anxious and you know that certain situations cause you more anxiety, recognizing what those situations are, being able to recognize them, and then also being able to, if it is a situation that you can avoid, then maybe that's what you do, but also maybe also coming up with some coping skills of how you're going to deal with it the next time you come up with that that trigger happens. So also managing your time, making sure that you have a schedule, that you go by, that sort of keeps us busy and active, and can definitely be a source of distraction for us. So managing your time is important. Practicing relaxation, mindfulness, yoga, whatever that may be for you, having that quiet time where you can reflect and be by yourself is really important. So taking a break from what's going on, and hopefully getting an opportunity to refocus. Also, we've talked about daily exercise before. And again, exercise can be whatever you like to do. It could be walking, it could be biking, it could be dancing. It could be whatever is fun for you. And really doing that on a regular basis is important. Setting aside time for yourself to do some fun stuff that you enjoy to do. Like maybe you like to read or go to the movies. Though that's a little bit hard right now during the pandemic, but doing those things for yourself is important. Nutrition, eating well, eating unprocessed foods, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, those are important things that can help you. And sometimes this can be a tough one, but getting enough sleep. Sometimes when you have a mental illness or a mental disorder, sleep can be sort of tough to come by. But if you can get that sleep, that's very important. And again, that comes back to sort of that regular schedule I talked about earlier. I mean, the more you can be on a regular schedule, especially when it comes to your sleep, that's important too. Avoiding drugs and alcohol is important. That actually it may be a temporary relief from what you're feeling, but it actually it can make things it makes things a lot worse. So you want to try to avoid that. And finally, just talking to someone, finding someone you can talk to about what's going on, someone who's going to listen to you, and someone who you trust is really important. So, and hopefully maybe seeking some form of mental health counseling through your local mental health agency, or wherever those resources may be for you in your community. So, so that's also important. So those are just some things to do to help you manage what's going on. I will say that the mental health, getting mental health help is really, really important part of that. And so I think that can't be underestimated. So. So Paul, I think you were going to talk a little bit about how people can help.
Yes.
Someone who is experiencing a mental illness.
Yes, and mental health professionals cannot do this work alone. The role of the community is so important. The role of family and friends is so important in the outcomes for people who are suffering from mental illness. Just like when we're cold or we have the flu and someone brings us chicken soup and tucks us in and says nice, caring things to us, that helps us recover better. The same is true with mental illness. And stigma, as Bucky was talking about, plays such a large role in trying to be well. Also can play a really difficult, really important role in the outcomes of mental illness. So how you can help is you can really pay attention to the judgments you have in your head when you see someone that's having some difficulty. Sometimes in the community, certainly in the community, I've seen people with mental health challenges who may be exhibiting behaviors that may seem odd, or they may say odd things to you. And sometimes we are fearful of those people. The reality is people with mental illness are no more violent than regular people as far as statistically. And even though the behaviors may seem out of the ordinary, those people are still very much in need of empathy, care, social relationships, and people who care about them. So even though they may be exhibiting odd behavior, still be nice and caring, and a smile, and saying, you know, hope you have a good day. Those are things that can be really positive. When you have a friend, maybe, you know, saying, oh man, that guy's really weird, does weird stuff. Like maybe just try to understand or ask questions. Like I noticed you do that a lot. I'm wondering what's that about. Sometimes people who may be on the autistic spectrum, they may say things or do things that are outside of the norm. Some people with some physical disorders like Tourette's syndrome, they may say things or have facial expressions that seem outside of the norm, and we may make assumptions about that. So again, going back to understanding that our perspective may not be accurate and that we may want to check with them. One example I can think of from my life, when I was younger, I was working on a volunteer project with a man, and I kept saying things to him and like, hey, how are you? And he would just walk past me and ignore me and keep working. And I started feeling like, wow, this guy's kind of a jerk. Like here I am trying to, you know, reach out, and we're both working together, and I just want to be friendly. And then at one point he turns around and he looks at me and says, do you know that I'm deaf? And I had no idea that he couldn't hear what I was saying. And so my whole paradigm and outlook changed. So the more that we seek to understand behavior and we are kind of hold back on our judgment, the more we might learn and have more empathy for what people are experiencing or how they might be different than us. And so practicing your active listening skills, being supportive, not like challenging our fear that, just because someone's exhibiting strange behavior doesn't necessarily mean that they're dangerous to us, or um, and certainly isolation is not a good thing for anyone. We all need people. We know that people with positive relationships in their lives tend to do better and to thrive more. And those relationships are really important. And in fact, some disorders like schizophrenia, in cultures where there are some cultures where schizophrenia is considered someone that has access to the spiritual world, and they are revered as like shaman or people who people have this extra insight. And in Western culture, those people are often sort of stigmatized and shunned. So you would imagine, which culture would there be better outcomes for people with schizophrenia? And that's the one where they're seen as revered and having some special abilities. Those people tend to accept them more, and they have a much better outcome than the people who are sort of shunned, and people kind of ignore them and they become isolated. So certainly you can play a role in learning more about mental health illness, and respecting people and treating people as you would want to be treated, and recognizing that, and Bucky said something really important earlier about everyone has unique strengths, and everyone has something we can appreciate and something to offer the community and to their friends and their family, and really looking for those things and focusing on those things, and not necessarily what's not working for a person. That's really important. And so, and I think also going on, I'd like to just on that give one more example. When we talk about lesbian, gay, transgender, queer people, that used to be a diagnosable disorder. When we talked earlier about having power to say what is normal and not normal behavior, and I kind of put those as society disorders, where society's lack of empathy, understanding, create difficulties in other people. And I think the LGBTQ community has faced this, where, even the American Psychiatric Association used to label homosexuals as having mental health disorders, when really, now we've come to see that that's just another path of human experience. And yet these people were sort of persecuted because of the stigma around that mental health. And I think gender identity is another area where, does it harm anyone for someone to express their gender how they want to? No. But society gives a lot of negative feedback to people who may have a different gender identity than what their biological sex may be. And so it's really important that we recognize the power that these labels have, and that we come at this with empathy and understanding. And Bucky, you're going to talk a little bit about some resources.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, I think that we all have different things that we're not good at, or we want to call them disabilities. But I think if we can frame them differently and frame them as opportunity, frame it as an opportunity to learn something different, an opportunity to learn about, a person besides what you see or what you observe. And so it's a learning opportunity for us all. And I think that I hope that you would take advantage of that opportunity, because it is an opportunity, and you can learn so much. I'm just thinking in my years of as a school counselor that I've learned so much from my students, and especially students who have been going through mental illness. Just amazing, some of the amazing things that they do, and they continue to amaze me. And so I just really think, if I hadn't looked at it that way, if I sort of just said, oh, they've got this mental illness there, if I sort of put them in a little box like that, that I would have never had that opportunity. So resources, there's lots of resources out there. We're going to name a few here, but one of them is the National Alliance of Mental Health, and some of this information that you've been hearing today is from them. Also, the National Institute of Mental Health. They have a lot of great resources. And there's something else called Mental Health First Aid. And I know that Mental Health First Aid is actually, they have trainings that they will come into your school or into your business and will actually provide that training and basically how to help you deal with mental health. And I always think of it, I think we referenced this in an earlier video, we talk about how important it is to have CPR training and being able to, be able to save someone's life. And so if you think of it as mental health first aid, is that same thing. I mean, you're learning learning some skills that really are helpful to you and helping you with to work with people who have mental illness. So yeah, those are some resources. We would love that you may have other resources. We would love to hear your comments or questions that you may have. So please don't be afraid to add your comments to after you finish watching this video. And thank you for sticking with us. And Paul, do you have any last words?
No, and I just wanted to say thank you all for taking the time to listen to this. And with Mental Health First Aid, that is something that you can do to be more supportive to those in your community, to your friends and your family, because we all know someone. If we don't yet, we will know someone with a mental illness, and they are a whole person with lots of strengths, skills, and sometimes mental illness, and we love them all the same.